We're living in an era where the official story is falling apart. And if you think the government is only lying about our present, well, you haven't seen what they've done to our past. In this episode, we're gonna cover the Kincaid Cave cover-up, an Egyptian citadel hidden in the Grand Canyon, and the underground Pentagon at Raven Rock that proves the mountains aren't just empty. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of March 12, 1909, a small, dusty newspaper called the Arizona Gazette ran this very brief blurb in their morning edition. It was really just a few sentences long, and it was tucked away in a column where nobody would really notice it. The blurb simply stated that a man named G.E. Kincaid, who was a seasoned explorer from Idaho, had just arrived in Yuma, Arizona. And he had come down the Colorado River on a solo rafting trip, and he claimed to have found some very interesting archaeological discoveries along the way. Now, to the average reader in 1909, this was nothing more than filler. It was throwaway. But looking back, that little blurb was actually the first loose thread in a cover-up that has lasted for more than 100 years. Now, Kincaid was not a random dude, because according to all the archives, he had spent 30 years working directly for the Smithsonian Institution. He had ample experience hunting, exploring. However, weeks before all of this, he was alone on the Colorado River. He was in a small wooden skiff navigating the rapids about 42 miles upriver from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon. And as he was rowing, he did what he always did, which was scanning the sediment formations on the canyon walls, just looking for mineral deposits. And as he did and looked up the east wall about 2,000 feet above the riverbed, he saw something and he just stopped rowing because there was this stain on the sedimentary rock. Now, to the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than discoloration from water runoff. But he had spent 3 decades in the field, so he was very familiar with his geology, and he knew that that stain did not match the rock formation. This, what he was looking at, looked like man-made pigment, kind of like the runoff from a chemical mixture. So very curious, he steered his boat over to the bank and he tied it off to a scrub brush. He grabbed his camera and his sidearm and he began to climb upwards. And folks, this was not an easy hike. This was a sheer cliff face. He had to pick his way up this nearly vertical wall, grabbing onto loose rocks and roots, pulling himself up foot by foot, and he climbed for hours. And so when he finally reached a shelf about 1,400 feet above the river, he found the source of the stain. But he didn't just find that, he also found steps. Many of you stay up late watching long-form documentaries and digging through reports, relaying the details after long videos, but the problem is shutting your brain off when it's finally time to sleep. I mean, trust me, I lay in bed many times at night just scrolling and reading. Well, that's where Dream from Beam comes in. Dream is a premium, all-natural nighttime beverage designed to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and wake up feeling genuinely rested, not foggy. It's been used to support over 30 million nights of sleep, and it's built specifically for people whose minds don't slow down easily, like mine. I didn't want to take a pill or melatonin or any sort of quick knockout. So what stood out about Dream is that it's designed to support your sleep cycle, not enforce it. Now, according to their own studies, 97% have reported an improved nighttime routine, 90% have experienced less nighttime restlessness, and 80% said they were sleeping more deeply. Now, those aren't miracle claims, they're consistency claims. About 30 to 45 minutes before you go to bed, you mix 1 scoop into hot water or milk or tea and you blend it and sip it as you wind down. That's it. Dream uses a combination of clinically studied ingredients like magnesium, L-theanine, reishi, and apigenin, and it's available in a melatonin-free option if that's important to you. And it's pretty clean. I mean, it's vegan, non-GMO, free of dairy, gluten, and added sugar. Now, the biggest difference for me wasn't just falling asleep faster, it's waking up feeling like my sleep actually counted. So if sleep has been the one thing holding you back lately, you can try Dream for yourself using the link and code on screen or in the description. And in fact, there were these massive sandstone steps carved directly into the cliff face. They were eroded and worn down by centuries of wind and rain, but they were unmistakably cut by human hands. But they were too big. They were too precise to be the work of the local tribes that Kincaid knew inhabited the area. So what gives? Well, he pulled out his gun and then followed the steps. They led away from the cliff edge back into a hidden alcove that you couldn't really see from the river. And there, hidden behind a mess of desert brush and river debris, was the mouth of a cavern. But again, Kincaid saw that this wasn't a natural cave. The walls of the entrance had clearly been chiseled because they were smooth. So he just took a breath, and he stepped inside and he turned on his lantern. The beam of his light cut through enough darkness that he was expecting just to see a shallow mine shaft. There might be an old prospector's tunnel from the gold rush days. It was very possible. But as he looked around, his light didn't hit a back wall. It just kept going. And then he realized that he was standing in this massive main hallway that was cut straight into the solid rock. And branching off from this main hallway, just like the spokes of a wheel, were dozens of other passageways. And the more he decided to explore, the more he began to notice things about his environment. How the air inside was very cool, it was dry, and he would shine his light along the walls, and he could see that there's what appeared to be tablets carved into the rock, but they weren't in English and they weren't Spanish. And upon looking closer, they were not the petroglyphs he had seen from the Hopi or Navajo tribes. These folks were hieroglyphics. And having worked for the Smithsonian and having seen the catalogs of the world, he recognized the style immediately. Folks, what he looked at looked Egyptian. But none of this made sense. He was in Arizona. He was literally in the Grand Canyon. So he's like, no, this can't be possible. He backed out of there, he went back down the cliff, he got in his boat, and he went straight to Yuma. Now, he didn't tell the newspapers the details, he just said he found something interesting. But then he sent a message to Washington. And this is where the story shifts from his solo adventure to a full-blown operation. Because according to the records that would be later leaked, the Smithsonian didn't ignore him. They didn't tell him he was crazy. They responded by sending a team. And several weeks later, he returned to the cave entrance. But this time, he wasn't alone. He is with a man named Professor S.A. Jordan, who is a leading archaeologist from the Smithsonian, along with a team of about 30 or 40 laborers and assistants. With them, they brought tons of gear, they brought generators, they brought lights. They were very well equipped to explore this mystery. And so quickly working, they strung up electric cables all along the ceiling of the main hallway, which illuminated the space for the first time in what was likely many, many years. And once the lights were on, Professor Jordan and Kincaid realized that this wasn't a hideout. This was a citadel, or an underground city. And in fact, as they got the chance to look around and explore more with light, based on the number of rooms and the layout, Professor Jordan estimated that upwards of 50,000 people could have lived comfortably inside this structure, or I guess cave, whatever you want to call it. And in fact, they found what they referred to as a massive room they called the dining hall. It was about 700 feet long, and they found these cooking utensils and urns. But the urns were made of copper and gold, hardened metals, folks, that required blast furnaces to create. So how is that possible? They found granaries, which are huge cement bins that were still filled with seeds. And when they tested them, they were a species of food that was not native to North America. But all they could do was go deeper. And as they did so, the discoveries became much more grim. You see, about 100 feet from the entrance, they found a cross hallway that led to the crypt. And inside the room, there were rows and rows of actual mummies. They were wrapped in a bark fabric and covered in clay. But as they were observing the bodies and kind of just looking over them, Kincaid made a very interesting observation that there was something very specific about these bodies. And upon examining them closer, every single one of them was male. I mean, there was no women, there were no children, and based on the artifacts that were buried with them, things like copper swords, shields, these weren't civilians. This was a type of barracks. I mean, these were trained warriors. And after that, they found the shrine. This was a massive chamber located about a mile underground, okay? A mile. And in the center of this room, sitting on a stone ledge, was an idol. Now, Kincaid described it in his notes. He said it looked like a man sitting cross-legged with a lotus flower in each hand. The face was carved with a very calm expression, and to both Kincaid and the professor, this looked like Buddha. However, the carvings around the statue, the symbols on the wall, they were undeniably Egyptian. Now keep in mind that at this point, you have a Smithsonian team standing a mile underground in the United States, mind you, staring at a statue that links ancient Egypt to ancient Tibet, surrounded by 50,000 warriors in a fortress that has no reason to exist here. They then decided to explore further, and they discovered the deadly chamber. Now, while they were exploring the outer edges of the citadel, Kincaid found a heavy stone door that was sealed shut. But unlike other rooms, which were dry and dusty, the air around this one was a little bit different. In fact, Kincaid wrote that there was a deadly, snaky smell coming from the cracks in the door. The workers tried to get close to it with their lights, but the air was so thick and foul that their electric lights simply would not penetrate the gloom. And anyone who got too close to the door started to get really dizzy and nauseous and sick. And so Professor Jordan, realizing that this is some very serious chemical protection, or that maybe there was a trap that was still very much active after all these years, just immediately ordered his men to back away. And he said, "Do not open that door." So they just left it sealed, and they never found out what was behind it. Wait a minute. You would think that a discovery of this magnitude, I mean, we're talking about potentially a lost civilization, advanced metallurgy, mummies in the Grand Canyon. This would be the biggest news story of the 20th century. I mean, there would be a museum wing named after Kincaid. So what gives, right? Well, for a brief moment, it looked like that was gonna happen. On April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette blew the lid off the whole thing. They ran a front page article with the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." And the sub-headline read, "Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from Orient." The article detailed everything. It quoted Kincaid, it quoted the professor, it described everything they found and they saw in vivid detail, from the mummies to the tools to the rooms. 11 days later, on April 16th, 1909, there was a rival newspaper called the Coconino Sun, and they ran a short hit piece. They mocked the Gazette story. They basically called it a hoax, a tall tale, that it was simply impossible. It was nothing more than just a way for them to sell newspapers. Now, I don't know if that piece discrediting the original article worked, but for whatever reason, the original story kind of just vanished from the overall news. And Kincaid kind of just vanished too. I don't mean they physically vanished, but I mean you just didn't really hear about him anymore. Interestingly, if you go to the Smithsonian Institution today, or if you write them a letter, which people have done for decades, mind you, and you ask them about G.E. Kincaid or even the 1909 expedition, they'll tell you the exact same thing every time. They'll basically say that it never existed. There is no record of anyone named G.E. Kincaid ever working for us. We have no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan, and obviously, there's no record of any Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. The whole thing was a hoax. It was staged from a fake newspaper article in 1909, and that's it. For them, it's case closed. However, folks, it doesn't end there, because if we look at it as a hoax, well, where do we even start, right? Because Just the sheer granularity of the Gazette article, you have to understand that hoaxes from that era were usually vague. They were about giants or monsters. And this original article contained very specific architectural details. We're talking about measurements of the rooms, descriptions of the metallurgy that were very consistent with archaeological science that hadn't even been fully developed yet. And then there's the issue of the Forbidden Zone, which is, according to authors like David Hatcher Childress, who investigated this story in the 1990s, right? Because people are also curious about this case. The reason nobody could find the cave today isn't because it doesn't exist, it's because it was erased or covered up. These researchers claim that shortly after the 1909 article ran, the federal government came in and they completely seized the area. And they say that the entrance to the cave, that hole in the cliff that's 1,400 feet up, was dynamited shut. The rocks were blasted to cover the stairs. The traces of the trail were then wiped out. And if you look at a map of the Grand Canyon today, specifically around this area where he said he was, which is 42 miles upriver from El Tovar, you'll see something very strange about the names of the rock formations in that specific sector. They aren't named after American presidents or local tribes. They are named the Tower of Ra, the Temple of Isis, the Osiris Temple. So what's up with that, right? The official explanation from the Park Service is that these were just names chosen by early map makers who liked Egyptian mythology, that it was just a trend in the Victorian era to name things after exotic places. But many believe that those names are actually markers and given not as a tribute, but as a label for what is actually buried underneath. Ha ha, that's what really lurks beneath, right? Jokes aside, that specific area of the canyon is very difficult to get to, and there are no official trails leading to the Isis Temple or the Tower of Ra. And in fact, large sections of that canyon are deemed dangerous terrain and are very, very much so restricted to hikers. It gets even weirder because for decades, people have reported seeing unmarked black helicopters and drones patrolling not just the Grand Canyon, but that specific airspace. So did G.E. Kincaid hallucinate an entire underground city? I mean, was the Arizona Gazette just trying to sell papers? Or did somebody walk into a cave in 1909, see something that could potentially rewrite the entire history of the human race, and the most powerful institutions in the world decided that the truth was too dangerous to be let out to the public? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? According to the few people who've actually tried to hike into that zone, have actually been turned back by armed guards. So what's going on? Maybe it's nothing. Maybe the Arizona Gazette really made it all up, but I don't know about you guys, but with everything going on in the world right now, I'm not gonna actually say the name of it, but with some specific files that were recently released to the public, let's just say that trust in any sort of higher governing authority is at an all-time low. But you know what? I'm just presenting you the information. You guys decide what you want to believe. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know the truth. All of it remains a mystery. On the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, there's a very tiny rural community called Blue Ridge Summit. This is the kind of place that looks like a postcard from the 19th century. I mean, you got apple orchards, winding country roads, old Victorian houses tucked back into the trees. It's quiet, or at least it's supposed to be. Now, for decades, the people living here have talked about a specific legend involving the massive mountain that looms over their town. They call it the Mountain Hum. Longtime residents claim that if you go outside on a really stagnant, quiet night and you stand perfectly still, you could feel this low frequency vibration coming up through the ground. Now, some people say it sounds like machinery humming deep underground, while others describe it more organically. They say it actually sounds like the mountain itself is breathing. Now, usually when you hear legends about breathing mountains, you kind of assume that it's just the wind catching the valley the wrong way, or maybe the vibration from distant power lines, because it's just it's easy to dismiss, right? Well, one of the people who grew up in the area around this mountain is a man named Hal Neal. And Hal knew better to dismiss it because he knew what lived on the other side of the tree line. Hal's house was located right next to a high chain link fence topped with razor wire. And every day, he saw armed military police officers patrolling the perimeter. Now, to Hal and his neighbors, this was just Site R. They knew it was a government facility, maybe a storage depot or a communications relay. And so they just got used to the armed guards. They got used to the no trespassing signs stamped with the Department of Defense logo. But what Hal and the rest of the town did not realize was that the hum wasn't just old machinery, and Site R wasn't simply a storage depot. The mountain was breathing because inside of it, the United States government was hiding a secret city designed to survive the end of the world. And in fact, it happened on one of the most tragic days in American history, September 11th, 2001. To understand what he saw that day and why the mountain hums, we actually have to go all the way back to 1951. Now, according to a 1949 National Security Council proposal, the United States was terrified of the Soviet Union's brand new and shiny atomic bomb. You see, President Harry S. Truman decided that Washington, D.C. was a death trap. If a nuke hit the White House, the government would be decapitated. So, to try and mitigate this, Truman approved a plan to build an alternate seat of government, a backup America hollowed out of solid rock. And they chose Raven Rock Mountain in Blue Ridge Summit because the granite there is incredibly tough. It is called greenstone, and it is some of the toughest rock on the eastern seaboard. Now, in January of 1951, the federal government used eminent domain to seize 280 acres of this very mountain. They kicked out the farmers who had lived there for generations, they told people in the area to leave, and then they brought in heavy machinery. Now, according to construction records from that time, they hired a company called Parsons Brinkerhoff. And these were the guys who built the New York subway tunnels. They brought in blasting crews who worked nonstop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just drilling into the face of the mountain. Now, if you lived in Blue Ridge Summit in 51, you didn't hear a hum, you heard explosions, pretty much nonstop. The crews removed around 500,000 cubic yards of granite. They bored 5 parallel tunnels, each one big enough to drive a semi-truck through deep into the heart of the mountain. Now, the initial cost was about $35 million, which in today's money is roughly $350 million. So next time you wonder where your tax dollars are going, well, by 1953, the blasting stopped. The dump trucks left, and massive 30-ton steel blast doors were installed at the tunnel entrances. And then the doors closed, the trees grew back, and the mountain went silent again. Now, the facility, which was officially codenamed Site R, went onto hot standby. It was legally designated as the Alternate Joint Communications Center, but the press had a different name for it. A 1954 issue of Life magazine called it the Underground Pentagon. However, for the next 20 years, nothing happened. The guards stood at the gate, the locals farmed their apples, the mountain just sat there, waiting for the next big world war. But that never happened until July of 1976. By the mid-70s, the Cold War had cooled off a bit, and the facility was technically staffed 24/7. But it was mostly a skeleton crew of communications specialists and military police. It was boring duty. You were guarding a rock in the middle of nowhere. But on a clear summer night in July of 1976, well, according to a declassified Army document that was released via the Freedom of Information Act in 2021 by a researcher named John Greenwald, the military police at Site R encountered something they were absolutely not trained to handle. You see, that night, the desk sergeant at Fort Ritchie, which was the nearby Army garrison that supported Raven Rock, got a frantic call from the Site R security post. You had two separate security patrols. These are men who were trained to identify aircraft and threats, reported seeing 3 oblong glowing objects hovering directly over the Raven Rock complex. Now, you need to understand the context here, right? Because this is not a random field in Nevada. This is the underground Pentagon, and it's one of the most heavily guarded, restricted airspaces on the planet. So if a Soviet bomber or even, something like a private Cessna flew into this airspace, they would be intercepted or, shot down immediately. However, the reports indicated that these weren't planes. In fact, it stated that the objects were silent and they were not using jet engines. They were hanging there, glowing, and disturbingly, right above the nuclear bunker. And so, the desk sergeant got another call, but this time it was from a guard who was stationed near the ammo storage area, located just outside the main bunker where the military kept its sensitive munitions. Now, the guard also reported seeing a UFO hovering low over the ammo dump. Now, why would that be? Well, the documents show that the military took this extremely seriously. They were not laughing about little green men. They were tracking an intrusion of unidentified craft over a continuity of government facility. And then, just as quickly as they arrived, the objects vanished. They didn't shoot at the base, they didn't land, they just observed, and they seemed to have left. And like many cases similar to this, the incident was never really explained. I mean, sure, the Army investigated, they filed the reports, and then classified them for 45 years, and for the locals in Blue Ridge Summit, it became just another part of the legend. And as time went on and we got into the 1990s, there was talk from the government about mothballing the whole place just to save money. And by the turn of the millennium, in 2000, most people in Washington, D.C. didn't even really know it existed. It was just this cold, damp hole in Pennsylvania. But then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. In Washington, D.C., the Secret Service initiated what is called Continuity of Government, or COG. Now, this is the playbook that Harry Truman wrote all the way back in 1949, and the plan was relatively simple, and that is to take the most important people in the American government, put them on choppers, and hide them deep in the earth. And back in Blue Ridge Summit, Hal Neal, the man I talked about earlier, was standing in his yard, and it was about 11 a.m., and like everybody else in the country, they were deeply concerned with what was happening in real time, watching all the news, when he heard the sound of what he knew were rotors. Now, according to an interview he gave to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in December of 2001, he watched as 5 massive military helicopters descended out of the sky. But they didn't land at the main gate of Site R. They landed right near his property at the base of the mountain. Now, moments later, he also saw a convoy of black SUVs with tinted windows tearing up Harbaugh Valley Road. These weren't police, these were federal agents, and they were driving pretty aggressively. They blew past the stop signs and they drove right up to the main portal of Raven Rock, and then they were gone in the main tunnel. At the time, Hal didn't know it, but he was witnessing the activation of the Doomsday Machine. According to journalist and historian Garrett Graff, who wrote the definitive book on this subject, one of the passengers in that very convoy was Vice President Dick Cheney. While Bush was on Air Force One, Cheney was brought here to the undisclosed location. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz was also brought here. And for the first time in history, the underground Pentagon was actually being used as a Pentagon. Now, inside the mountain, the lights came on, the ventilation systems, the source of that hum, kicked into overdrive. But for everybody who lived in the area, the real terror actually started a week later. You see, on September 19th, 2001, the tension in Blue Ridge Summit was already sky high because they knew the vice president was likely inside the mountain next door. They saw the fighter jets patrolling overhead, and then a delivery truck carrying furniture tried to enter the main gate at Site R to deliver supplies for the influx of staff. Now, according to many local reports, the truck actually triggered a chemical explosive detector at the gate. The sensors went red, guards drew their weapons, and the base went into a full lockdown. People were terrified that this was going to be the next target, but it turned out it was nothing more than a false alarm, just a sensor glitch on a furniture truck. But the psychological damage was already done. And at this point, many of the people in the area realized this wasn't simply a government office. They were living next to target number one in a nuclear war. So what's actually inside the mountain, and why are people reporting a humming noise? Well, for years, the government has refused to comment on any of the specifics. But thanks to the work of investigative journalists and a few slip-ups by the Department of Defense, we now know why Hal hears that vibration. To put it simply, the mountain hums because it is keeping 5,000 people alive. The scale of Raven Rock is almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. And when you pass through those 30-ton blast doors, which are designed to withstand a direct nuclear impact, you aren't just walking into a dugout cave. According to a layout description published by the Morning Herald back in 1977, the cavern actually contains 5 separate freestanding 3-story buildings. And I mean, they are literally buildings floating on massive industrial springs and shock absorbers. And so the idea here is that if a nuclear bomb hits the mountain, the shock wave will travel through the granite, but the buildings inside will kind of just bounce on the springs, protecting the people and the computers inside from being pulped by the vibration. It is a literal self-contained city and has 2 massive reservoirs carved into the rock, so underground lakes labeled the old and new reservoirs, each holding millions of gallons of drinking water. And it has everything else, a fully stocked bar, it has a chapel, it has a barber shop, it has a medical facility, a fire department, and a massive industrial ventilation system, huge intake fans hidden on the mountainside that suck in fresh air, filter out radiation and biological weapons, and then pump it down into the caverns. And in fact, in 2018 alone, the Department of Defense allocated $45 million just for the operating budget of Raven Rock. So this place isn't a relic, it is active and it's ready. And there's even a quote from Garrett Graff that puts this into perspective better than anything else. He said this: Raven Rock is the place where nuclear war in the United States would begin, which basically means that if Washington, D.C. is wiped out, the order to launch our nukes back at the enemy would come from a desk inside that very mountain. And hopefully, that day will never come. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below hidden truth, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into true cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And as always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.